We're glad you could come and listen to another and watch another class from the BYU Family History Library. We're still not physically in the library yet. We're hoping to be able to do that in the not too distant future. It may be happening somewhere down the road, and that we'll be back in the library. But these classes online are going to continue, at least we hope they continue, because of the way that this has been helping a lot of people around the country that otherwise would not have access to the library, even were it open. And also, I'd like to mention that these classes are begin at 3:30 Mountain Daylight Time and go on. There are 3 classes privileged. We're going to be trying to expand those in the future also, so we may have more classes here. So stay tuned, look at the BYU Family History Library website, and you'll be able to get all the information you need about future classes. I'm going to talk today about discovering your ancestors in Australia. I have, as you'll find out as I go through this presentation of this class, that I have some very direct connections to Australia through 3 of my ancestral lines. And so that makes it more interesting to me because I do have relatives there. If you have relatives in England and you've traced those relatives back in time and then start to do descendancy research, it is pretty possible that you would end up with an ancestor either who came to America and came to someplace in Canada or the United States, but it's also very possible that you have real relatives, descendants of your ancestors who ended up in Australia. So this is something that should be of interest to anyone who is doing research in English or Scottish or Irish ancestry, because all of those countries ended up in Australia. Okay, well, let's get into it. Just a couple of general observations about genealogy. First of all, genealogical research is a mixture of history, geography, linguistics, and paleography. Paleography, as I'll talk about a little bit, is the study of handwriting, of the way that language is ancient. Paleo is old and graphy is writing, so it's old writing, and it can be quite a challenge. And these are the areas that are most importantly investigated if you're going to be interested in doing genealogical research. A note here from a quote, "A people without the knowledge of their past, history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." And that's literally true. There's just no way that that you can get into doing any kind of other than just really basically recording the members of your immediate family and going back 1 or 2 generations. But anything further than that in genealogical research requires mandates, another word that I could use, that you know some of the history about the people that you're investigating. You really need to know about each of those countries, and it may be very difficult. I can give you a lot of examples. England is even, and Australia both have interesting histories, but many countries in the world, like what we in present day call Germany and other places like that, have extensive histories that are, without knowing that history, it is almost impossible to find the right person, because you can always run into the same person, same name for different people in your genealogical research. Of course, we need to understand that Australia is an old country. The Aborigines in Australia first arrived on the mainland from the maritime Southeast Asia about estimated between 40,000 and 70,000 years ago. So they've been there for a very, very long time. And we jump a long way forward in history to between 1606 and 1770. More than 50 European ships made landfall on Australian soil. Most of these people, most of these islands and places were either discovered by very specific exploration expeditions that were sent out from different countries, from not just from England, from other Norway, from the Netherlands, from Portugal, from Spain, and other places that it's hard to determine the first people that discovered these various land masses, but they were mostly people out for either looking for gold and jewels and trade, or they were whalers, fishermen, and people out there. But but a lot of them began coming to Australia. And the first one that made the European landing that we're aware of was a Dutch navigator, William Janszoon Bale, in the Difken ship. And he made the first European landfall. Well, this created an interesting situation because with the Netherlands making claims and England making claims, that there had to be some kind of adjustment made. So the English began the process of sending out their explorers and their people to make claims. So on the 22nd of August of 1770, Captain James Cook claimed the east coast of Australia for Great Britain. Captain Cook was quite an interesting character. He managed to get himself killed when he tried to interfere in the politics of the Hawaiian Islands, but he was instrumental in extending Britain's claim to Australia, to the entire continent. And eventually that's what happened. And so the first British fleet was sent out 18 years later, and it went to what is now New South Wales. This is the kind of thing that is helpful, that I go back to the original first statement that I made. When we start to talk about places in these countries, especially for English counties, for example, and then we learn that Australia has provinces, which correspond roughly to the same kinds of lands as provinces in Canada. And the names of these provinces are things that you need to become familiar with if you're going to do research in any of these countries, because understanding where an event occurred. So for example, if I said that someone was born in New South Wales, and then they tried to say that the same person or someone in that same family was born in Western Australia back in this period of time, then how in the world would you know the difference if you weren't acquainted with where New South Wales was and where Western Australia was? So obviously here the suggestion is that you immediately go to a map. If when I say New South Wales, if you don't have a picture of where that is on the map of Australia, then you need to go to look at Google Maps or any number of maps online and just put in the map of Australia, and it'll come up with hundreds of maps. And then you can begin to become acquainted with these areas. Also, to get a rough idea of the size of these countries, because there's a vast difference between having two counties in England and having two provinces in Australia. They can be in Australia, they can be thousands of miles apart. And that makes it across a huge desert. And so making that even more of a difficulty to get to back and forth to have people related in those two different areas. Of course, once you get into Australian history, you find out that there was well, you can look at this two ways. It was either a very unfortunate thing or it was a very fortunate thing. what was unfortunate was that England was taking the people who were convicted of criminal offenses, and instead of housing them in prisons or poorhouses or wherever they could in England for that cost, they figured out that it was cheaper to put them on a ship and ship them down to Australia, where they could be essentially involved in forced labor as convict slaves. But they figured out that it was also in their interest to create a real population in Australia in order to maintain sovereignty over the entire continent, because they had competing claims. So they began sending people as early as 1788 from England who were basically converts. Now, the effect of this over the years, and kind of going fast forward with history here, is that many of the people in Australia, millions of the people in Australia, are descendants of these original convicts. And unlike other countries like the United States, for example, where a lot of convicts were shipped here, they're called transported. They were transported to. So when you hear of someone being transported from England to the United States or transported to Australia, that means that they didn't do that voluntarily. They were not, it's not just a matter that they were put on a ship and transported there. They were transported under an order from the court, or because they signed an agreement of some kind that would put them into an apprenticeship or to I'll come up with the word in just a second. But anyway, they were basically bound over. So they were bound to, under contract, bound to go to this country. But these people were just there because they were criminals, and you can find out a lot about them. And between 1788 and 1792, about 3,546 males and 766 female converts, I got an extra comment there, were landed at Sydney. So you say, well, what's going to happen here? Well, this was interesting, because at that point in time, there were certainly a far more number of male convicts, laborers in Australia than there were women. And so there was another big push in England to increase the number of people who were emigrating to Australia. And so just a few years later, on the 16th of February, 1793, the first free settlers arrived. Now there was one kind of interesting thing here, and that was that if a convict married someone in Australia, even one of these free settler people, ladies who arrived in Australia, then they were given a pardon of their criminal activity. So they became, in a sense, free by marrying a free person. This will come up in a story that I'm going to tell in just a little bit here. And the first place was Adelaide, South Australia, in 1839, and was founded as a free colony without convicts. So they're originally, even beginning in 1839, there was a colony that eventually got big enough to be considered a colony in 1839. So if we extend that out, however, there were, between 1788 and 1868, 161,700 convicts, and only 25,000 of whom were women, were transported to the colonies of New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, and Western Australia. So these were the primary shore colonies that were built. So you can see from the numbers here that between the free colonists who were coming and began to come in the 1800s, and all of the transported people who were in Australia, that there's a a fairly large number of people that that were able to get a fairly good living. And that was what the benefit was. They were, unfortunately, they came as convicts, but fortunately, after a period of time, they kind of worked their way out of that convict sort of situation. And many of them became landowners, and many of them became, and they all, the ones who didn't die, obviously, but all of their descendants became the people in Australia, who, by the way, honor their convict ancestors. In the United States, we have a tendency to ignore the fact that our ancestors may have been transported to America. In fact, it's very difficult sometimes to, when we get back into the 1700s, to find certain individuals in the United States, because they seem to just appear kind of magically in the colonies. And the real story behind that is that there was a significant percentage of the original American colonists who were also transported to America, rather than just came here for freedom of religion and all the other things that we usually hear about. So it's not very surprising to find out that they were, and the word I was trying to get a minute ago is indentured servants, or that they were slaves, or that they were here on some other kind of arrangement. So this is, but this was the foundation for the original population and the additional people who were added to it. Now, getting into the genealogy of this, there is a specific website out there on Convict Records of Australia. And the Convict Records website has, you can search from 1787 to 1867, and it gives you all of the different information about the convicts. And this will give you generally the area where most all of the people who were transported from primarily from England to Australia will be found. Now, this isn't the only place, but this is one record you can look for. Now, when you have this kind of record, over in the corner, you'll see in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see I have the URL. Now, the good news about these classes now at BYU is that they're now being recorded, and we will have, assuming they've recorded this one, and then we will have the recordings will be put up on the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. So you might see these on the YouTube channel now, beginning now, because we're beginning to record these. Previously, there were some difficulties in having that done. But when you see this, if you see anything like this that says Convict Records or whatever the name of the website is, if you'll just take a quick note, I can, or if you'll ask in the chat, and then we will put the name of it. But when you get this and you look for Convict Records Australia, this website will come up. So most of these things can be easily found by doing a Google search. But there's the actual URL. Okay, now we're going to get into some stories here, because I think it's really gets to be interesting when you can see how this really works. And this was a person who is not one of my ancestors, actually, but you'll hear the story now. Edward Rodwell was a former convict, and he was deported. And then he got a ticket to leave to marry Sarah Parkinson on in February, and they had 2 children. Subsequently, Edward Rodwell, at that point then, had been granted his pardon for his criminal activity. And after having married Sarah Parkinson, he decided that he didn't like Sarah Parkinson that much, and he ran off with and married Sarah Parkinson's sister. And then he returned to England. So we have a line of her sister, Sarah Parkinson's sister, who is my direct line ancestor. And she was married to this Edward Rodwell, and then subsequently she got married. But the interesting thing about this is, in the illustration, is that Edward Rodwell's records are abundantly available, not only on Family Search, but they're also available on Ancestry and on Find My Past. So between Ancestry, Family Search, and Find My Past, we have been able to identify the entire court record of Edward Rodwell and everything that happened when he got to Australia as a criminal, and then the marriage and the subsequent remarriage to a sister, and then all of the family and their line in England. So all of this is easily, not easily, but it is ultimately, is a better word, ultimately obtainable by doing searches and doing the research on those three major websites. So here's how I'm related back through here. So you've got me back through my family, and I go back to my great-grandmother, Eliza Ellen Parkinson, whose father was Thomas Parkinson and whose wife was Sarah Parkinson, who was the one who was married to Edward Rodwell, who was the one that ran off with her sister to England. So first of all, this is an illustration of some of the records. So this is the New South Wales, Australia convict incident, 1788 to 1842. And what that tells us is that it gives us the date of his conviction, the place in England where he was convicted, his estimated birth date, the ship he left on, he was put on, he didn't leave voluntarily, obviously, the ship he was put on, and the arrival in New South Wales, and the date of arrival. All of these dates and all of these places help to establish with with a remarkable amount of specificity about his particular life. And on the other side over here with Ancestry, you've got suggested records, which are a lot more information. And there's lots and lots of records, it turns out to be, about this person. And here's the whole list of the suggested records. So I don't know why I have a line in front of it, but I do. It looks like it's going to stay there. So we have New South Wales, Tasmania, convictions and pardons, registers, all of these different record sets are either on Ancestry, Find My Past, or Family Search, or all three, or on two of the three. So they're all sort of spread out over those three websites. So when you're doing this particular research in Australia, you need to be aware of this. Oh, and he was convicted of housebreaking. In other words, burglary. A lot could be said about English laws and how they worked or didn't work, or how they were just or unjust. But the actual results, as far as many of these people, was that they benefited substantially, ultimately, by ending up in Australia, where there was land where they could then become ranchers or farmers, which is what they did. And so that's where the background and the culture and the history of Australia dates back to. So one thing we have here is another interesting law. The South Australia Act in 1834 forbid the transportation of convicts. You can kind of see that didn't really work completely because the list of convicts goes up until in the 1870s. But basically, they began the process of getting rid of the convicts. But they did another thing. They took the poor English immigrants who were assisted by an immigration fund. Okay, so here's what it did. many of the people, and because of the changes because of the Industrial Revolution, and also because of the way that the industry and economy was changing in Great Britain, would be from purely agricultural background, and a lot of the agricultural land was being recaptured as pasture land for primarily for sheep, because of the huge weaving industry and cloth manufacturing concerns that happened in England around during the early part of the Industrial Revolution. Well, what this did was it threw basically the farmers who were tenant farmers, who were only on the property because they were allowed to be there and pay rents to the landlord or the landlord of the manor. And so the manor property people were losing their jobs and were either going to factories or starving. And so the people in a lot of the parts of England were being the system that they had created was what were called poorhouses. And there's a huge long history of poorhouses in England, and there are a lot of records also, poorhouse records. A lot of the instructions and information about these various types of records you can find, and the lists of them you can find in the familysearch.org research wiki under the search tab on the family search. If you go to and begins to do the searching here on these various topics, you'll find lists and links out to a lot of these records and a lot of explanation about this history. So basically, you're looking at a situation where you had people who were very poor, and in addition to being very, very poor, they were living in parishes in the Church of England area or the civil parishes, two different governmental areas. But the parishes had the responsibility for providing for their poor. Well, that was just an economic decision, because it was because of the history with the convicts. It was pretty common knowledge, I would assume, that it was quite a bit cheaper to ship these people off to Australia and or other places, rather than put together a sort of a lifetime dole where they were supported by the parishes in the poorhouses. So what they did was they put these people on ships and shipped them to America. Now this was not involuntary; it was sort of semi-involuntary, because they had no prospects in England, and they had at least a possibility of a prospect of being free people in Australia. So they began the process of shipping these people out. And that's how my ancestors managed to get from England to Australia. Now, there were some other things that gave a pretty good incentive to go to Australia, because gold was discovered there in 1851. And yes, the information on the right-hand side about that gold nugget is true. It was 630 pounds of gold in one nugget. Interesting stories about how some of these huge nuggets were found, and you'll notice down at the bottom it says the value was about 12,000 pounds. But today, the gold nugget, that gold nugget on Hill End in 1872 would be worth about $13.3 million at current price of gold. So that would be what you would see the relative value of that was at the time. It was basically changed the entire economy of Australia. Now we're getting up into 1880. By 90% of the people in Australia were British and Irish born. So you can see that there's it's sort of not a kind of place like in the United States, where we had people coming from all sorts of countries. By 1880, we had immigrants from most of Europe and and even from the Far East and of course from Mexico and from all sorts of places. We were having immigrants come into the United States, but Australia, because of its isolation and total control by one country, was just open to only a few types of people. And so everyone to this point in Australia. Now that's vastly changed over the last couple of hundred years, because since 1880, Australia has become quite a bit, it has a lot of other minority influences. And this is when they had the opening of the first Parliament of Australia in 1901. Now, you might ask yourself a question, why would I want to know this if I'm looking for people in my family? Well, all of these events that I've just talked about, from the transportation to the free, to the poorhouse equivalent to the shipping of free Australians, every one of these events creates a new set of records, a new part of the record that has been preserved, and where you can begin to find more and more information about your family. And this is the same whether you're thinking about Australia as an individual place, or you're thinking about any other country in the world. This direct relationship between the events, the historical events, and the events that occur in your individual ancestors' or relatives' lives is a one-to-one. So when they created a parliament, that created a whole new set of records, and it created a whole new set of relationships. So the first thing that happened was there's some major national genealogical record sources that were made. And these were Australia's civil registration records. This was a concept that came about in the 1800s, when the governments began relying heavily upon conscription to fight their various wars. And so they needed more and more information, not only about the present population, but the potential future population of their countries. And because they needed that information for military purposes, they began to keep records on everybody's registration. How did the United States avoid this? Besides the fact that we have a tremendously undertow of what we call freedom here in the United States, probably one of the real reasons, just speculating here a little bit, was that we didn't ever have a foreign land war in the United States. That we didn't have people invading our country or attacking or directly our country. And we've managed to avoid that over the years. So, but Australia was part of the British, ultimately part of the British Empire, but eventually part of the British Commonwealth. And so their their laws and their way of registering people and keeping records was paralleled what was happening in England and the British Empire. So you can see the dates there. These are cutoff dates. So in other words, if you're looking back in time and you're looking at civil registration records, they're going to basically stop in each of these places on those dates. Before that, there were no registration records. So this is where they start. And for this reason, you need to also be aware not just of the history that creates this, but also the specific history of each of these record sets, so that you know that you're not looking for something that just never was or did not exist. Now, another interesting thing is that that it's interesting to see is that the census records. And you can see here, there's a list of all the different census records. And you'll see that they're kind of spread out in different websites. So you can look here on this sheet and see, starting about 1811 to 1925, there's books, and then there's census and ancestry, 1819, 1891, and then 1828, so forth. So these are all the different fragments and censuses that exist for different years for each of the different provinces. So studying this is not as straightforward as simply going to the US Census and coming up with the census records that you need. You need to know specifically what records are available and what years in the various provinces. So here's some additional records. Obviously, you can go through convict records and you can look at church records. Now, here's a kind of unfortunate situation from the standpoint of the way records were kept. The Church of England, of course, had a long history going back into the 1500s, 1538 with Henry VIII. But basically the people who were, let's just say the people who were transported to Australia were not necessarily awfully church-oriented people. And it took a while before church records became really valuable. But as people came, the free people came and the immigrants came, they were obviously still very much church people, and the church records were kept. So you're going to get kind of you need to look at the convict records and the church records. This is not a way that you can say, well, I'm going to find it all in the church records. No, you're not going to find it all in the church records. You're going to find it in all the various records. And the real key to almost all records, getting accurate genealogical records, is identifying the exact location of events in an ancestor's life. And those come from land and property records as well as other kinds of records. And but they're very important in Australia, because that's when the people became legitimate. When they were settlers and they actually owned property is when you'll begin to be able to trace the people through the generations and through the property. Obviously, military records are very important. They're not necessarily as emphasized enough, because even though Australia has not been directly invaded by any country to date, except the original invasions by the Europeans, the country itself has supplied a lot of military support to all of the wars. And so you're going to find a lot of military support through the British Commonwealth and the British Empire. And you'll find Australians in World War I, World War II, obviously, and many of the other wars. As I've kind of already shown a little bit, I guess the convict and the name of the ship and the transportation qualifies as a passenger list. And so there are substantial and very helpful passenger lists that help you to follow your English ancestors across and down to Australia. And then there are British emigration records. Immigration is coming into the country. Emigration with an E is going out of the country. And England was careful in recording the people that left. So there are emigration records. So how would we go about tracing a family from England to Australia? And in this case, over to New South Wales. They're on the east coast of Australia. So we can look for, in this case, the pauper immigration was financed by the 1834 English Poor Law Amendment. This is for James Parkinship. You can see in his short list of events here from Family Search that he was born in Ramsey, Huntingdonshire, and it was one of the parishes that decided to implement this Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834. And so he ended up leaving England with his family, his entire family, and died in New South Wales. So that was kind of a giveaway that there was this movement across the ocean. So here's his birth in 1808 in Ramsey, and here's his death in September 1870 in Brookfield, New South Wales. And here are the records. And here is the record of him coming across to the on the ship. So here's your ship manifest or passenger list. And so you can see where him and his children all came. And there's Eliza Parkinson and Sarah Parkinson. Sarah Parkinson was my ancestor, and Eliza is the sister that ran away to England. So they got to Australia on the 11th of March of 1849, which puts them fairly early in the history of Australia. So then you can get into, this is a Find My Past record that you find his death year, his death registration, and the death registration district and state and country. And then it also gives his father's first name that helps you make sure you're working with the right James Parkinson. It's not a really common name, but it's not an uncommon name. You find quite a few confusions in trying to separate out all the Parkinsons. So this is the important focusing place, and you can see there that there is a very specific place to begin looking for more records, because you've now got a very distinctive place name in Dungog, New South Wales. So now we can go in and see, go back, and we have the family that left, and you can see that they were pretty early in their lives. They were not old people when they left. They were pretty young and had young children. And and here are a number of records from Ancestry that will give you another huge list of records to go from. Now, what I have been finding with the records for England between Family Search, Find My Past, and Ancestry is that the record hints are extremely valuable because they just keep popping up all the time. You have to be careful and look at that so you have the right person, but basically it automates your research to a great extent. Now, the problem here is that there are still limitations in the records, and you still have to do quite a bit of original kind of priming the pump kind of research to get started with this process. But as you come forward with the descendants of these people, it becomes much more doable. I am never going to try to use the word easier because none of this is easy, but it's doable to start making some significant discoveries of the number of ancestors. So you can see from the sidebar here that there are a number of new records that could be looked at and added as source records. So the important thing is to focus on the location and the time frame. So you need to have an exact location in the place you're going to. And then you need to go to let's start looking for records that fall within the category of those in that place and that time frame of when your ancestors might live there. That seems a little vague, but it's actually it's actually dependent on how specific the place is. If I was looking for English records between 1840 and 1850, that would be it would not be useful. If I'm looking for English records in Huntingdonshire between 1840 and 50, it is still not even marginally helpful. And if I'm looking for someone's records in Ramsey, Huntingdonshire in 1840 to 1850, I could look through almost every page of the records in every set and be able to find the people I'm looking for. Even if I wasn't sure of any dates, I could find the people. So this is, the location is the largest, most important factor in making accurate inroads into family history. Sorry, pushed the button too fast. Go back here. Now we're going to talk about some rather extensive and, in my estimation, one of the largest collections of digitized records in the world that I'm aware of was funded and collected by the National Library of Australia in LA. And it is an amazing collection. Good news, bad news, once again, wrong way. Good news, bad news. And this is the reason why. This is their website. It's called Trove. And Trove is the digitized website for the National Library of Australia and hundreds of other partner organizations around Australia. They have simply pulled all the records into this one humongously large website. Now, good news. It's got so much more than you could ever begin to imagine. Not so good news. A lot of it is available only with a library card with the National Library of Australia, which you happen to have to be a citizen in order to get it. That does not discount the vast number of things in the library that are helpful and available without having to have a library card or a subscription to the web. There's no subscription, it's just a library card. But remember the large online, and the number of records that they have on this record site have just gone into the hundreds of millions, into the billions and billions of records. It's amazingly huge. So remember the large sites. Now I've mentioned Find My Past, Family Search, and Ancestry, but you also need to remember that MyHeritage is out there, and they will be and continue to acquire a lot of records that are helpful. Not so much as the other three websites in England and Great Britain, but if you happen to have some connections in Europe, they're extremely valuable to have do searching in MyHeritage. There's another website here. There is a separate website for Australian cemeteries, and they have an Australian cemetery registration, and they can begin the data. A cemetery. This is different than Find My Past and Billion Graves. Find a Grave and Billion Graves, and Find a Grave and Billion Graves both have extensive preferences in Australia, but this is one of the big websites for Australia, and it's Australia's cemeteries, australiancemeteries.com.au. And the whole point here is to keep looking and look hard and keep searching and not give up. And if you need help, there are a variety of sources out there that are just overwhelmingly helpful. One of which I would like to mention is the Family History Guide. That's the fhguide.com. The Family History Guide is a free website, partner with Family Search. It is it's a premier place to go to get an organized, structured way of investigating. And Australia certainly is one of the countries where there are a lot of records. Okay, well, thanks for watching.